Welcome to De-Risky Business, the economic security podcast from the Center for a New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm your co-host, Emily Kilcrease.
And I'm your other co-host, Jeff Gertz. On today's episode, we are joined by CNAS Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Defense Program, Becca Wasser, to discuss some of the long-standing problems plaguing the U.S. defense industrial base and how the Trump administration's tariffs are only making life harder.
We also debrief on the latest news from London, where U.S. and Chinese trade negotiators have been meeting to try to get the trade war truce back on track. And we explain why it's such a big deal that export controls have featured so prominently in this round of discussions.
And finally, a reminder to all listeners that if you haven't yet had the chance to check out the great programming from the CNAS annual conference, which we hosted here in DC on June 3rd, you can watch recordings of all sessions at conference.cnas.org.
As always, listeners can reach us at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. This podcast is supported in part by Amazon and through general support to the CNAS Energy Economics and Security Program. Jeff, before we get to our conversation with Becca Wasser about the defense industrial base, we should talk a little bit about what's happening on the U.S. China trade talks front. We're coming out of a series of intensive negotiations between, on the U.S. side, Secretary of Treasury Bessent, Secretary of Commerce Lutnick, and Ambassador Greer with their Chinese counterparts in London to try to come to some sort of resolution of the escalation on the tariffs and other measures that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. So what's going on?
Yeah, well, we got the news Tuesday night that we have an agreement of sorts, I guess, agreement question mark, a sort of handshake for a framework for an agreement, maybe. But it does seem like there's been some type of mutual de-escalation here from the reporting that's out there, which frankly is pretty scant, and it's not really clear if we're ever going to get any type of actual formal written statement on any of this. But it seems that we've at least gone back to where we were in the Geneva talks from a month or so ago, where both sides are, keeping their tariffs at a more moderate level, maybe we could say. And most importantly, it seems these talks focused mostly on the export control piece of it. So the U.S. had real concerns about Chinese controls over rare earths and critical minerals. Again, it seems one of the things the U.S. wanted coming out of the Geneva talks was a Chinese agreement that they were going to allow those rare earths to flow to U.S. companies, and the U.S. was not happy with some delays there and kind of other slowdowns in that process. So I guess that problem's been fixed, maybe?
Oh, no, I think we're good now.
We're good now?
Yeah. It's worth maybe kind of walking through just the brief timeline of how we got here. Because this is really messy and this is not a trade deal, right? And so understanding how we got here, I think, will kind of hammer home that point, right? So Liberation Day tariffs, Trump announces large tariffs on most countries around the world, 35% additional tariffs on China on top of the 20% tariffs that they had already imposed for fentanyl reasons. As everybody now knows, there was this pause pretty quickly after Liberation Day on everyone except for China. China hits back with retaliation. We end up in this highly escalatory cycle with tariffs from both sides exceeding 100%, basically threatening to halt trade because you just can't trade with tariffs that are that high. They become essentially prohibitive. You then have these talks in Geneva where both sides agree to de-escalate. They bring tariffs down to still high, to be clear, still very high, but not prohibitive levels of tariffs. And there's this sort of agreement on China easing up on some of the rare earths export controls. But then there was no written document that said what that agreement was. There was nothing for either side to point back to be like, we agreed to this, you're not complying with it. Pretty quickly, both sides start accusing the other side of reneging on the commitments. And then from the U.S. side, you saw a bunch of additional measures come out. We saw all these export controls being placed on particular companies who make choke point technologies, like the very fancy software that's needed to design complex semiconductors. You saw the student visa restrictions rolled out by the U.S. So even though there was this temporary truce agreed to in Geneva, it pretty quickly unraveled. So you get to London, and they're basically trying to agree on what was agreed on and agree on how to implement the agreement moving forward, but nobody actually knows what the agreement is. And that's basically, is that
clear? Right?
I think it's pretty clear what's going on here. So, what's your sense of how likely this truce is to last?
For how long?
I don't know. What time is lunch?
Yeah, exactly. We've made it 12 hours now, maybe. So look, we are still operating against a mid-August deadline. So when they agreed in Geneva to roll back tariffs, they said that was a 90-day truce, just like the original pause on the Liberation Day tariffs was a 90-day pause. So we still notionally are up against this sort of mid-August deadline when tariffs go back to their prohibitive level. Real question is what's going to happen between now and then. Obviously, we also have all the other Liberation Day tariffs that need to be resolved between now and then, so lots of moving pieces here. I think, is this going to be... this hasn't solved the underlying problems in the U.S. China relationship. It is very clear the sort of deep structural problems of, all of the industrial policy, everything else that is going on in China's approach to its economic relationship with the United States, and likewise from China's point of view, all of the controls the United States has on technologies, those are all still there. We are not kind of resolving those pieces, so we haven't fixed any of these problems. I do think this will probably buy us some time, right? We keep on coming back to this point that the United States is hitting up against its own limits in what cost it is willing to impose in order to extract some costs on China. So long as that is the case, I don't think you see an interest in escalating from the United States at this point, but we still haven't solved any problems.
So the question I keep asking myself is whether we're going to be in a stronger position vis-a-vis China at the end of this process or not. And it's not clear to me that we're going to be in a stronger position yet. All of this energy, all of these negotiations have gone into de-escalation, right? They haven't, as you said, they haven't touched the core underlying issues. So are we actually making progress on the core underlying issues or not? It's not clear. We're mostly just talking about ramping down measures that both sides have ramped up in the last couple weeks or months. There's also, I think, an important question about whether we are doing damage to our own strategic interests, particularly by bringing export controls into the conversation. Now, I mentioned that the U.S. had put in place new export controls on particular choke point technologies as the Geneva truce was kind of breaking down. That reportedly was to build some additional leverage as the U.S. was moving into the talks. But it's important to recognize that that is a huge new precedent in trade talks.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, maybe it's worth looking backwards here a little bit, particularly to how this was carried out in previous administrations in the context of U.S.-China tech competition. Because certainly if we look back at the Biden years, we see this massive ramp up in new controls, particularly around semiconductors and related tools. And obviously this was a diplomatic kind of flashpoint between the two countries, but the Biden administration took a very clear line saying none of this stuff is up for negotiation. These are things that we are taking for our own narrowly defined national security interest. We are only imposing controls when necessary for national security, and therefore, because they're necessary for national security, kind of ipso facto, they are not to be negotiated away because we need them for national security. The Trump administration has moved away from that paradigm. I think it's pretty clear now.
Yeah, and it's not just a Biden paradigm, to be clear, right? Like this came up in the
long-standing export control policy.
Yes, it's just we just don't negotiate over national security.
Exactly, and it's the two pieces of it, is that we only impose export controls when we need to for national security, and then because of that, we don't negotiate on them.
Right.
Where the Trump team is now going, I think, is really blurring both of those lines.
Yeah.
Right? And I think this goes back to, you were saying in recent weeks they've imposed controls over new choke point technologies. I think there is a question of sort of, are these actually choke point technologies or not? Another real issue here is a real lack of transparency on exactly what some of the controls were. So again, we have press reporting. Essentially, the Department of Commerce was sending letters out to several companies saying, the product you are selling to Chinese customers is now controlled. You can no longer sell it to these. Again, I presume in those letters they were explaining that by reference to core U.S. national security interest. But I think if you look at what's actually played out here, which was that the United States was unhappy with something China was doing. The United States then tells a bunch of U.S. companies they can't sell to China. The United States then goes and negotiates with China and mutually agrees to roll back these controls. It's pretty clear that wasn't really national security, at least in the kind of narrow definition, how we normally think about it in the export control context. It was much more just a way to gain leverage over China, to have something to negotiate away against your asks. That kind of opens the Pandora's box of, all right, which export controls now are open for negotiation and which are not? it's going to be harder and harder for future U.S. negotiators going into negotiations with China or frankly with any other country, where again, they've always just had the kind of stock talking points of that is not on the table, that is not something we are willing to entertain. Now it's not as clear. It's harder to just come in kind of, point blank and say, no, that's off the table, because we now have an example. Actually, we will negotiate on some of these things in some instances.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I think it was a big misstep for the U.S. to try to build leverage in this way, because now China, if I'm China, I'm going to ask about that in every single meeting, because
absolutely.
It's been such a bone of contention. I also think, there's another reason why potentially it was a misstep, which is that if the U.S. needs to keep imposing new measures to build leverage, what does that say about our assessment of our overall leverage? Like, if we need to keep doing more stuff to maintain or build leverage, maybe we don't actually have as much leverage over China as we think we do. Maybe we have underestimated China's ability and willingness to stand up to some of the U.S. economic measures. And so maybe we've just miscalculated this whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something we'll get into in our discussion with Becca soon as well. But all of the asks here seem to be about U.S. access to these critical minerals and rare earths that China has control over. So maybe they actually have a lot more leverage on us than we've really been willing to face up to up until now.
All right, another good news story here on De-Risky Business. All right, back soon with Becca Wasser. We are delighted to welcome to De-Risky Business, Becca Wasser. Becca is Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Defense Program, and she's joining us today to talk about the defense industrial base and the impact of tariffs on the DIB. But most importantly, Becca is my former office mate, and we had a great plant collection. Welcome to the podcast, Becca.
So glad to be here. The plants are still thriving, but I miss you as my office mate.
Oh, that's why we're bringing you on the pod. This is so great.
Well, now three's company, I guess?
Yeah, that works, right?
Yeah, although I'm not committing to sharing an office with both of you.
We would never do anything.
We're already off track.
All right, let's get on track here. So Becca, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. This is an economic security podcast. We like to start each discussion with our guests by asking, how do you define economic security? What does that term mean to you? And maybe I'll kind of note up top, I think this is really great because often we bring on economic experts, sort of trade experts, others who are thinking about how do they incorporate the security aspect into economic security. You're a security expert, a defense expert. Where does economics fit into your view of sort of the security work that you do?
What a great question, and what a hard question. Not one I often get asked. So let me frame it almost purely from a defense lens, which is economic security to me is about maintaining the access to the resources that underpin U.S. military capabilities and also ensuring the resilience of those resources. So here it really comes down to everything that feeds into America's ability to maintain a defense technological edge over its adversaries, because that is such a core component of deterrence. And I think this is one of the reasons why, at this current juncture in time, we are seeing economic and defense tools being so intertwined, because there's almost this dawning realization, maybe you all knew it, but I don't think, the common person did, but this intertwining of these different tools because they are so mutually reinforcing and so critical. And I think this is one of the reasons why we've also had such an uptick in interest in defense industrial base issues, because this is the nexus of defense and economics.
Absolutely.
And speaking of the defense industrial base, one of the reasons we wanted to bring you onto the podcast, Becca, was because you, along with our CNAS colleague Phil Shears, just released a great report called From Production Lines to Front Lines, Revitalizing the U.S. Defense Industrial Base for Future Great Power Conflict. We will link to this in the show notes so folks can find it easily. But the report does a great job, just a very clear-eyed and sobering assessment of everything that's going wrong with the defense industrial base today. So why don't you just give us a quick synopsis of the main findings of the report? So for folks who don't follow the DIB issues closely, what's going wrong right now?
What isn't going wrong? So let me give you sort of the TLDR of like the main strapline findings, and then go into some of the defense industrial base obstacles that we currently face. So this report really got started because I was noticing that there was this disconnect between all the conversations I was having about defense strategy and then the ones that I was having about the industrial base. And so this massive disconnect between defense strategy and industrial reality has meant that we have a defense industrial base that's unable to meet demands of modern conflict. We've seen that the industrial base got overwhelmed in trying to provide equipment to Ukraine while backfilling U.S. equipment, while also trying to, help shore up other countries like Israel and Taiwan. And so if that's how it's struggling right now, it's going to get even worse when we look at the potential demands of future great power conflict. And then, if that wasn't bad enough, you then take into account some of the dynamics that we expect to face in the future: greater adversary cooperation, more advanced technologies, the potential for simultaneous conflict and protracted war. This just makes the problem set even harder. So with all of that being said, we've got a tough problem, but the record scratch moment of how did we get here? And the short version is the US government has the defense industrial base it paid for. There have been so many different choices that have been made over time that have resulted in this relatively hollowed out US defense industrial base. It is because there is not a lot of competition and there is continued defense consolidation. That means that there's not innovation, there's not competition in the way that we might want, because also competition helps drive costs down. Additionally, there's a really unclear demand signal that has stemmed from the US government over time, and that has made it really difficult for defense to really be a profitable market for a number of companies. That means that you have smaller mom and pop shops that have just exited the market altogether. It also means that it's really difficult to do planning, whether that is planning for having the right materials and facilities for building the types of things that you might need. There's also so many rules and regulations, some of which are incredibly necessary, but some of which have just resulted in a bureaucracy that makes it so hard to do business with the US government and the Department of Defense. That makes it really hard for allies and partners to contribute to the US defense industrial base. And at the end of the day, we just have an industrial base that can't produce the right types of equipment in the right amounts and fast enough and in a way that is more flexible to meet some of these changing global demands. So it's not really a great story at the moment, but I guess the upside is there's a lot more that we could do to fix it.
No, that's the perfect tone for this podcast.
Yeah.
We usually don't tell happy news stories,
Yeah.
so that actually is worse than what we usually talk about,
Yeah.
I think. I want to go back to something that you said at the beginning, which is that we've got a defense strategy that basically doesn't meet industrial reality, right? And we actually talk about something similar all the time on the economic security side of we have a sense of what we want to do on the economic security side, but we're not organized to do it. We don't have the right instruments, right? So is that a good analogy to make it? And how do you think about how would you explain to somebody who focuses mostly on trade, what should our defense strategy be, and what's missing?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more complicated than what you just laid out, because I think you have a defense strategy that says, we will deter adversaries in this priority region using, deterrence by denial, for example. And undergirding all of that is a lot of defense capabilities that are intended to try and make it so that a would-be adversary believes that their action would not be profitable. But there's also all of these operational concepts that are being developed, throughout the U.S. Department of Defense and the services. So you have things like the joint warfighting concept. You have, different service, Navy, Air Force operational concepts, and all of those are being designed and developed without the idea of how many munitions will you need? How would you be able to get equipment A to place B. All of this just doesn't take into account the actual building blocks of defense, which are the capabilities, which are these enablers, which are things like munitions, and then sort of pulling that through thread all the way down to the critical materials, the energetics you might need to actually make those munitions explode. Things like that aren't being thought of.
That seems helpful. You want them to explode.
You want them to explode, usually.
I don't know defense, but that just seems like something you want.
We don't like duds for a reason. But, no one's really taking any of this into account. And so there's almost this thing of making assumptions about what industry can produce and just assuming it can be done. When that's not actually the case. And part of what I think is really necessary is having a single conversation, right? Having industry and government talking together, but also making sure that it's not just the defense strategist, it's also the military planners. And then just being really transparent about some of the assumptions that are needed if you actually want to have these capabilities to do what your plan is.
You, in the report, have a lot of great recommendations about how to actually fix some of this stuff. And so folks should read that if they want to get more detail on that. But I wanted to ask one more kind of bigger picture question before we talk about how tariffs are definitely making everything better. Which is, do you think that these problems are fixable outside the context of a crisis? And I'm thinking, we talk about this a lot in the sanctions context of we all know there's stuff we need to do to coordinate and build a toolkit, but it isn't until Russia invades that we're let's go figure out the sanctions thing, right? And that's actually not the best example because there wasn't 3 months of advanced planning there. But do you think that a crisis is going to be needed to actually fix some of these problems?
I think a crisis is not enough. I think that we've already had crises, right? We've already had crises where we demonstrate that we can break through some of these bureaucratic barriers. We can do things differently. We can try and, we're never quite able to surge production, but we can ramp up production for needed things, even if it isn't traditionally how things have been done. But what I am so concerned about is we do that in a crisis, but we seem to lose those lessons learned and not sort of take the changes that we've made in crisis and put them into sort of our steady state peacetime. So I'm a little bit concerned that it's going to take a no-kidding conflict and a no-kidding conflict that we might lose to actually have that wake-up call moment. I know it's a small thing, and Emily, you and I have talked about this a ton before, but for the example of Ukraine, the U.S. has demonstrated that it can make massive changes to information sharing with allies and partners in order to provide what is needed, whether that's targeting, whether that's just basic information about the threat. And then as soon as that threat has changed, we go back to the old way of doing things where there are so many different barriers to just sharing basic information that doesn't necessarily need to be classified and often isn't classified. So that's just one thing which I know doesn't seem like it's tied to the defense industrial base, but let me tell you, information sharing is a huge blocker when you get down to div issues.
Yeah, no, I think it's really analogous to what we see on the supply chain vulnerability issues, where again, we sort of have the COVID shock, which is the wake up moment of all of our medical supplies, our PPE, we don't understand how supply chains work. Kind of do a big ramp up, try to better understand, all right, get supply chain visibility, where are all these goods coming from. 5 years later, we seem to kind of be going back. We actually don't have persistent long-term visibility into these supply chains. The problems just reemerge. So
yeah, and I think COVID-19 made the defense industrial base realize its own supply chain vulnerabilities, and that's why you've had all of these new illumination tools and trying to understand where some of these areas of risk are. But it was almost as though we learned one lesson from COVID-19, and that was, there's supply chain issues within the defense industrial base. And that's been our major takeaway. Yeah. We haven't necessarily made some significant changes to get around all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so maybe let's pivot to our favorite topic, tariffs, of course. So, look, obviously lots going on in the tariffs world, but we really want to have you on to unpack a little bit how all the different tariffs that the president has been imposing and announcing may be coming are going to be impacting the DIB. So certainly we've seen the steel and aluminum tariffs, which as of today are up to 50% now, up from 25% a few weeks ago. We have ongoing investigations on semiconductors and critical minerals for possible tariffs under Section 232 authorities. Obviously, those are both kind of critical supplies for the defense industrial base. And then, of course, on top of that, we have all the different reciprocal tariffs, the 10% universal tariff on all countries in the world. So how are tariffs impacting defense industrial base so far? And what are you worried about when you think about the impact of tariffs here?
What am I not worried about, and where have they not impacted the DIB? It just makes all of the existing problems so much harder. I think at sort of its basic level, costs are just going to be sky high. They're going to be sky high for consumers. They're going to be sky high for companies. They're going to be sky high for the U.S. government, who's going to have to eat some of these costs. I think we're also going to see some massive crunches when it comes down to supply, both in terms of some of those components or key materials that are tariffed for the most part. We're also going to see that just creating greater supply chain crunches, which are going to slow down production delivery dates. So already we have so many massive delays of major defense programs from shipbuilding to aerospace, and those are going to get even longer. So that's going to impact the United States, the ability for our U.S. military to have the critical weapons and systems that it needs, but it's also going to impact U.S. allies and partners who have been waiting sometimes for close to decades for the delivery of some equipment that they've purchased. So all of this is just, I could go on and on about all of the problems that this would cause. There are just so many, from what it means for demand for U.S. defense items, both domestically and internationally. We could go into some of the supply chain stuff. It just goes on and on. But if I can sum it up, the defense industrial base is screwed.
Good tagline there. I think it's, look, obviously the president and his team have this theory of the case of using tariffs to spur domestic investment to kind of bring onshore production. From looking at your assessment of the challenges facing the DIB, we do need more domestic investment and more domestic production. But suffice to say, it does not seem like this, tariffs as a tool to solve some of these long-standing problems in the DIB is going to pan out in your view. Is that?
I don't think it will. I think, listen, there will be some specific wins. We've already seen a lot of defense companies already trying to have U.S. subsidiaries, do some quote-unquote onshoring in the United States. To be honest, a lot of that had already been in existence. We're just hearing some companies point very loudly to what they already had, particularly in the shipbuilding industry. So I think we are going to see more U.S. investment, but I think at the end of the day, it's not going to fix the DIB. More so, on top of that, it is not going to get to the Trump administration's reindustrialization priorities. I see this as, honestly, a self-own. If you are trying to ramp up American industry, you're trying to bring some of those industrial jobs back, the DIB is such a huge part of that. And one of the big priorities is in shipbuilding and the idea of making shipbuilding great again. But in order to do that, you are going to need a workforce that isn't available. Guess what? You're going to need a ton of steel that you just made a lot more expensive. And you know what? You also have some components that you've already been producing overseas that now you're going to have to figure out how you're going to get it back over here or come up with a domestic source of supply. So at the end of the day, trying to onshore a lot of these critical industries, from minerals to even just steel and shipbuilding, all of that is just going to take years upon years to do. It is not a quick fix. So we are going to feel a lot of pain in, I don't even want to just say a short term, in sort of a short to medium interim, several years before we actually see any of this potentially bear fruit. But then is it a sunk cost?
So, Becca, the defense program also does a lot of work looking at defense budgets. Is there any indication that the government, the administration, will actually account for these increased costs in its budget for the Defense Department?
Absolutely not. I think already what we are seeing from some of the initial budget documents is the administration trying to say that its top line is higher, but part of that assumes what's in the reconciliation bill. Additionally, I think some of the initial things that we're hearing out of the Hill is that, for example, there's already been cuts to shipbuilding at a time where you want shipbuilding to maybe increase if you've just put out an executive order saying this is an area of high priority. So if that's the case, it makes me think that the administration isn't going to account for some of these higher costs. I think there's also been a little bit of a back and forth as it relates to the types of contracts that the DoD wants to have with industry. For the most part, there seems to be more of a push for firm fixed price, because if there are cost overruns, then the defense company eats that cost, not the U.S. government. But I think if we're looking at what some of the defense companies, particularly the primes, are going to be pushing for, it's not going to be firm fixed price. It's going to be looking at contracts that are cost reimbursable, so that when there are higher prices, when there are supply chain crunches, when a program goes years and years over its expected delivery, the onus is on the Pentagon, not on the defense companies.
So maybe just to briefly follow up on that, kind of curious what you're hearing about how some of these defense contractors are responding to tariffs. Was there like a contracting side to it? Are they pushing for tariff exclusions? Do they think that is a kind of viable path forward? Are they, were they able to sort of stockpile goods in the lead up to tariffs before, kind of get all their imports in earlier? Kind of what's been the strategy to date?
So I will say every defense company is different, from the primes to the non-traditionals, who are those new entrants and startups that we often hear about, to some of those sub-tier suppliers who are more of those small businesses, those mom and pop shops who have very different concerns than the primes necessarily. But if you look at what some of the leadership from the primes have been saying, it's kind of everything that you said and more. So it is trying to think about different types of contracts. It is trying to think about ways in which you could do some advanced stockpiling, particularly of what we refer to as long lead items. The one, I guess, kind of good thing about some of these tariffs is we know, for the most part, what the tariffs are on. So that immediately sends a signal of like, okay, if you need to have this type of material, if you need this component, try and acquire it in advance as much as you possibly can. But that ultimately goes against something that the defense industrial base overall has been essentially set up for, which is to do just-in-time efficiency measures, which means stockpiling for years and years has been a bad thing to do. There's no incentive to do it. There's no financial incentive to do it. So it's kind of upending how some of these companies have traditionally done business, because it's no longer just-in-time efficiency. And then the other thing that I'm hearing a lot from some of the larger defense companies is they are really hoping for defense exemptions and various mitigation measures, largely duty drawbacks. And duty drawbacks are probably something that you guys understand much better than I do. So I don't know if you want to explain to your audience what that is. And by your audience, I mean me.
I mean, I don't know if we want to go into the details of the duty drawback, but I will say, like, what we've heard across the board from the administration is, like, no exemptions, no exceptions. Like, a lesson learned from the first Trump administration, particularly with the steel and aluminum tariff program, is that they did issue those sorts of exemptions, and they thought it really watered down the program and undermined the policy objectives. So we'll see, how it goes, whether it's duty drawback or just a flat out upfront exemption. I think that's to be seen, and particularly if you have some of these big defense companies coming in and making a hard national security case, maybe there's going to be a little bit more give and take there. I think we'll have to keep an eye on the Section 232 investigations in particular, which are being run by the Commerce Department, where a lot of this is going to play out. But so far, like on steel and aluminum, you're not seeing a lot of flexibility at all, and I think that's a pretty good indicator.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, it just kind of goes back when you read when you read Section 232, when you read some of the executive orders, all of this is centered around the idea of national security and securing American access and just the country, and it doesn't. At the end of the day, it doesn't. So again, it goes back to what end is this for? Does it actually serve its stated purpose?
Let's talk about China. I think a lot of people who don't follow the defense industrial base would probably be surprised at the amount of stuff that we rely on to get from China that goes into our military platforms. I mean, this has flared up certainly in the recent U.S. China trade talks, where we're talking about continued access to the rare earths that are processed in China, some of the heat-resistant magnets, which seem important for military things for reasons that I'm sure you know much better than I do. But why? I mean, just talk us through that bit of things, which on the trade side does not seem to be going particularly well, and we talked about that a little bit earlier in the episode. But how much leverage does China have over our defense industrial base because of this continued dependence on rare earths and related products?
So as it relates to rare earths and critical minerals, they've got a lot more leverage than in other areas. Again, I think it's just acknowledging a little bit of history, right? That we made a choice in America that we were going to offshore some of our industries and some of our production overseas. And a lot of that went to China. And there were also other choices that we made as we start talking more about critical minerals, to no longer try and refine and process some of what at least we had domestically in the United States, which is not the full suite of minerals and materials that China has. And part of that was environmental concerns, things that the EPA put up in the United States, but it was a choice to just send all of that overseas. Except once we started to realize that there was this critical dependency and a critical dependency on a nation that we were maybe trying to de-risk our supply chains from, we didn't start taking steps to try and either change things to bring some of that processing back, to find alternate sources of supply, but also we haven't made some of the investments that I would argue we need in R&D when it comes down to the development of new material compounds and synthetic materials that would potentially allow you over time to have a lot of the same attributes without some of the environmental knock-on effects. So right now, I think this is really playing out when you look at critical minerals like gallium, which is so important for things like semiconductors and all microelectronics. But then for some of these rare earths that are just in almost everything, right? From fighter jets to munitions to sonars and radars, things that we need for air defense, that we need for, anti-submarine warfare, for electronic warfare. They factor into all of these because they just have a higher heat resistance point that we just do not have access to. And we're not about to start refining again in America, but we're also not looking to some of our friends, Australia, Canada, in the way that we should. And one could also argue that we've actually gotten into fights with some of our friends at a time where maybe that was a bad idea because we might need them for something.
I don't know what fights you're talking about. Seems like everything's going fine. As you're telling that story about rare earths, it resonates so much with what you said earlier in our chat about there's been some problems that we have known have been problems for so long, and we just haven't gotten to the point of fixing them. And when it comes to China finally really exerting and using the leverage it has over rare earths, which we've seen in the last couple of weeks, this should be the wake-up call. But what we're seeing is not necessarily a big move to fix the problem. It's just to get China to be nicer to us on rare earths.
Yeah, that's why it's wasn't 2010 the wake-up call? That was 15 years ago.
Yeah, that's a pretty big snooze button.
Yeah.
And I mean, this also, rare earths, that happened more recently. There had already been a de facto ban on so many critical minerals prior to this. It's been a slow, almost crawl, walk, run. Yeah. And people are acting as though all of a sudden it was a big sprint. And it's no, we could have seen this coming from a mile away. Mm-hmm. We just chose not to.
So we also want to zoom out a little bit and talk about some of the broader debates on defense spending that are going on today. So we know that the Trump administration, has been kind of putting together a lot of its defense asks and its trade asks in these ongoing negotiations with partners, pushing partners to increase defense spending. I think we have actually seen some movement here. So we've seen the Germans have sort of stepped up and said they're going to spend a lot more than they used to. Canada just announced they plan to hit the 2% NATO target. So some positive movement here. But I guess maybe the thing of this question, does the Trump team deserve credit for this? Are they actually driving that change in our partners and kind of getting the results we've been asking for a long time? And, what should the United States be asking of its partners when it comes to defense spending?
So I'll give the Trump administration some kudos for actually getting allies and partners, and particularly NATO allies, to step up when it comes down to defense spending. I thought that initially this was going to be perhaps a hand that the administration was going to overplay, and it seems to have worked out. Mind you, there's some fancy math going on, right? It's people trying to get closer to 3% and then 1.5 for some of these more infrastructure investments and whatnot. But it still is happening. But at what cost is my argument? We are getting to a certain amount of defense spending, but it's coming at the cost of, U.S. relationships. It's coming potentially at the cost where, because of tariffs, because of this transactional approach that the administration has had, there's perhaps maybe going to be less defense sales around the globe in a way that's going to hurt U.S. industry and arguably also hurt U.S. defense, because the U.S. military might no longer be as interoperable with some of its allies and partners as they start to build their own equipment or acquire from different sources. So at the end of the day, yeah, we've seen this big push for more defense spending, but I'm a little bit worried that that is just sort of one clear metric that people are holding to, but it's all of these other intricacies and important things that are going to be problematic in the long run for not much.
One thing that's coming up a lot in the context of the trade talks is the idea of purchase commitments. So basically what U.S. stuff can other countries buy in order to address the trade deficit concerns that the president is very focused on. And they often talk about military kit. Now, given everything that you're saying about how we don't even have enough kit for current U.S. needs and certainly not future U.S. needs, how viable is that strategy for other countries to try to increase their purchases of U.S. military equipment? And then do they want to, right? There is this trust issue that's coming up quite a bit. So how do you see that playing out?
So part of this goes down to a really, really unnecessarily complex process called foreign military sales. And that is a process that has been broken for years, and there have been multiple Tiger teams and congressional task forces to try and fix this. But I think a lot of what we're hearing with that sort of transactional approach that the administration has in trying to enter into these trade talks and say, okay, perhaps maybe we'll reduce some of the tariffs on your country, but what are you going to do for us? It is buying this military equipment. I would argue that that in itself is a viable approach, because there's already a recognition that you are not going to get that equipment tomorrow, in part because it cannot be produced fast enough, but also because of this lengthy bureaucratic process that just goes on and on for ages. There's also a problem when it comes down to prioritization of foreign military sales, where the Trump administration has said that they are going to essentially create a new prioritization framework. They just haven't been clear, like many of their frameworks recently, about exactly what that prioritization or rack and stack is. So it could be a viable thing, because it becomes almost a wait and see strategy. It becomes countries saying, yes, we will buy this, we will buy that. Depending on how far along they get in the process, there may actually be an exchange of funds, but they may actually be able to sort of sit and wait it out. And at the end of the day, even though we do have things like, European approach of trying to buy European and focus a little bit more on that type, on European procurement, it's going to take them a while to ramp up their own defense industry, and there are some needs that they have right now, particularly as they are looking to the potential for a reduced U.S. commitment in Europe. So there are some things that they would want to need. And again, this is also in some ways a cudgel that they can use to say, okay, we're still buying U.S. military equipment. We're still trying to be interoperable with the United States because guess what? You're still part of NATO and we want you to be there. So in some ways, we're hearing a lot about military equipment because it also serves various countries' purposes as well when it comes down to asking the U.S. to continue to have a stake in their own security.
That makes sense. It's actually quite similar in some ways to some debates going on tech and AI chips and other areas where these countries both want to be, sort of part of the U.S. ecosystem, but maybe not fully, are trying to signal, yes, we have domestic capabilities, but actually are still very reliant on the U.S. hyperscaler companies. And you see the companies trying to walk these lines, Microsoft putting out statements being, no, we're in Europe, we will not sort of, just go along with whatever the Trump administration asks us to do. I'm curious, looking out over the longer term, sort of, Europe will take some time to build up its defense industry, but do you think this is a sort of bigger, more fundamental threat to U.S. defense companies that basically, as trust in the United States wanes around the world, you're going to see more and more demands for domestic procurement that are going to come at the expense of U.S. companies?
Yeah, I think over time that's definitely going to be the dynamic. And I think there's also a broader dynamic at play, which is more countries are going to be trying to acquire advanced capabilities. And so we're going to see an uptick not only in defense spending, but also an uptick in the procurement of advanced capabilities, proliferation of precision-guided weapons in particular. So we're just going to see kind of a larger trend as it relates to an uptick in arms sales and arms trade and arms development, but that also has some knock-on effects for global security that I think we haven't fully thought through. Yeah, I'm being very bright and shiny today, clearly.
Yeah, this is maybe one of our more terrifying podcasts.
Yeah.
What did you expect from me?
All right, Becca, 2 questions to round us out here on what has been a fantastic conversation. Do you have any good news coming out of the U.S. defense industrial base? Let me rephrase it. I'm going to make you tell us some good news. What's your good news story coming out of the U.S. defense industrial base?
There is broad-based awareness that there are problems. And I know that sounds so basic, but I think it's a really critical part because we've kind of just glossed over it in the past. There's been an acknowledgement that there are problems within the defense industrial base, and you actually have lots of different stakeholders really seized with trying to fix it. And so Congress in particular has woken up to these issues. There's always going to be a little bit of tension with Congress because there are different constituencies that they want to protect, particularly as it relates down to various defense companies and weapons factories in their home districts or home states. But there are folks who want to do good in the world, right? And they want to help fix this. And so Congress is on board, industry is on board, and I think the U.S. government is on board. It's just trying to get everyone marching in the same direction, but also making sure we put some of the resources behind it. So all of that to say is there's common recognition that there's a problem, and there's common recognition that there need to be solutions. Just whether we get there or not remains to be seen.
All right, got to start somewhere. All right, last question, which we ask all of our guests. For folks who want to learn more about the defense industrial base or other issues we've been talking about today, what is one book or article or podcast or source that you would recommend? And you can't say your own report. We will flog that for you, but something else.
No self-noms are killing me. I would say a great place to start is Freedom's Forge by Arthur Herman. It's more of a historical look at the defense industrial base and the long path to mobilization for World War II, but it is a really interesting read. It's written so well, it's very interesting, and it is surprising how many of the issues that existed then still exist today, albeit with a slightly different twist.
Wonderful, that sounds great. Thanks, Becca.
Thanks, Becca. Thanks for listening to De-Risky Business, an economic security podcast from the Energy, Economics, and Security program at the Center for a New American Security. Have any questions or comments? get in touch at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. The nerdier, the better. And find us wherever you get your podcasts every other Thursday.